I began working in clay seriously once I arrived at Tyler School of Art and I began studying with Rudolf Staffel. And once I arrived at Tyler and began to work earnestly, it was something that I just could not pull myself away. It was addictive. It was something that I was very passionate about. I wanted to achieve as much as I could in terms of skill sets, learning how to fire kilns, learning how to throw on the wheel, of course, learning the history of ceramics. All of those things just became my life. I was so committed to learning this medium. Well, when you have a mass of clay in front of you, there's something so tactile about it. It's prompting you. You can feel the animation of it. So clay itself as a material is extremely animated in that it responds. And I think it's that response that is so provocative for me, is that if I push it, roll it, stretch it, press it, there's an immediate exchange. When I was painting, it was me always doing the heavy lifting in terms of making it do something. I can, in clay, if I push it, it's going to do something unexpected, probably. So I think it's the conversation between clay and myself. It's more likely to respond. It's more likely to initiate something that I didn't expect. And it's also dangerous because all those things that happen can end up disastrously. It's always risky for me. I don't have a process that is guaranteed. Anything, I have skills, I have an understanding of limits, and then there are always things that can happen that are either gifts or something that is catastrophic in terms of its results that I didn't expect, out of control, what happened here, all those things. My association with clay began with the potter's wheel. The fascination with it, I was never a production potter. That was not an interest, but the wheel became a tool that I could make shapes with. And once I built up a vocabulary of shapes, I could start to assemble. So, I was making pots, and then I was making sculptural larger pots. And the larger pots with their physicality made me think about sculptural forms. So I still hadn't figured out how to relate it to my own experience and find narratives around it. It was still an exploration of shapes and forms, and then beginning to read about the history of African Americans and finding imagery that was provocative. So the pieces were moving into more of emblematic forms and I began to work more ambitiously. I was doing wall pieces that were assemblages, and the assemblages became free forms that were in 3 dimensions as opposed to depending upon the wall, finding a relationship between and finding movement. I grew up in Pittsburgh. My mother had a garden. My grandmother gardened. We were very, very connected to land. And I have early on understood that it was important to be connected to the land and to own the land as much as you can, to not be in a position where you can be dispossessed or moved off of your land for whatever reason, that this is an important grounding substantive thing. So as soon as I could afford it, I bought a house with land. And realizing that my mother and my grandmother were both gardeners, I immediately began to garden that land. And it became an important source for my ceramics, for my sculpture, was the back and forth between shaping this space, shaping this land, and then being in the studio and shaping the clay, and shaping that space. So being in the garden and watching it do what it does, whether it is complying with my intentions or not, is always a learning experience. And so that's something that I think marries well with me as a sculptor and an artist, is to, imposing my will on things. That only works to a certain extent, especially when you're working with clay. So I'm learning or trying to adapt myself to this patience and slow, to watch it, to see if I'm bringing anything to it and what it's bringing to me. And that's what the garden does. About 10 years ago, I took a road trip through the South looking for African-American farmers and gardeners, and was able to have conversations with them, to talk about their history, what brought them to the land, how long had they been on the land. And so that became important to me. And I was struck by the anonymity of so many of the farmers and gardeners who aren't showing up in the magazines and aren't showing up in the books. And so that's, I like the idea that the sculptures I made about the farms and gardens name the names, call attention to the legacy of it and the significance of it. And so for me, that's, as a sculptor, getting to actually make these places known and the people who made the places known. The making the farm portraits, that was a breakthrough for me. It's because I was able to finally relate the broader history of African Americans on the land to my own history. So that's making that discovery of, okay, this is the common thread. This is the thread. This is the thing I have to explore. This is the thing that I have to see how much I can elaborate on this. So I think that was a breakthrough, and it has fueled different branches of work. So I also started doing what I refer to the farm bowls, which were actual bowl shapes that included artifacts that I had observed in my travels and in my research. And they too had names, and they too were portraits in of themselves. So, one thing leads to another. Different pieces become important at different times. Right now, one of the farm pieces that's called Albert and Albert Howard. And so Albert and Albert Howard depicts a farm, but it is positioned on top of two large wheels that are moving through what I refer to as a kind of muddy track. Albert and Albert are in Georgia, Monticello, Georgia, and they are cattle ranchers, and they also farm. So they've got produce that they make, and they build things. So there's this intensity of skill and production. To me, just their energy and their ability to be on the land and sustain themselves. They are essential. They are, to me, iconic in terms of that whole idea of naming names and identifying these folks who are so fundamental to the character of our culture, that includes agriculture at its base and land at its base. They epitomize, to me, the importance of land and being stewards of the land and being able to move around in these different ways on the land. I think about pieces that I've done about my mother, which are really significant to me. When I did the one clothespin with a basket, clothespin with the beans, all of those are, I'm so glad I got that idea and did it. This one I knew I have to do something about this bag of clothespins and what it represents. And so the series of clothespins is just ongoing. I don't think I will not be making the clothespins, no matter what else I'm doing. I know I will be making the clothespins because that's her. And there's so much about her that's in me. So, her and her different configurations and different guises, all of those things that gives me this sense of I can give form to this way of praising her as my mother and appreciating her as this figure, and knowing that it represents not only her to me, but when people look at it and they know what it's about, the significance of this form, they relate to. And it becomes something that is accessible, but at the same time has this majesty to it. I like the idea of the mundane and the extraordinary together. How a clothespin can become something beyond that and can embody those extraordinary feelings that we have. I can locate those feelings in a clothespin.